Okay, class. So you should have just watched the module where I introduced the story about raw milk in Canada, and primarily the United States, and the debate about whether raw milk should be legally sold or whether it should be legally available to people through things like herd share arrangements. And characterize Canada as really right now. The debate is clear. No unpasteurized milk is allowed to be sold or made available to consumers through herd share arrangements. Where in the United States, there's a huge variation from state to state, and there has been a number of changes over time with more and more states allowing raw milk sale. I'm going to share my screen with you again and get into the details of that case. Okay, so this paper by Rahn et al., I think that I like a lot, and I recommend that you read it. So policy framing, so I'm going to introduce, so this is Rahn's characterization of policy framing, and I've just added one quote here from Kuipers that tells us kind of what the word, why is the word framing. So policy frame may be considered to be the definition of a situation, according to Rahn et al. I really like this analysis by Kuipers. He says that the frame is something that draws out the particular elements of a picture. So if you think of a picture frame as the analogy, then the way that a picture is framed, or whether it doesn't have a frame at all, you see different things. The frame draws your eyes to different details that are in say a photograph, or different details during a drawing. So similar to pictures, ideas and events or facts are also framed. When we frame in a particular way, we encourage others to see these facts in a particular way, taking some aspects of a reality and making them more accessible than other aspects. So that is the story with policy framing, is that in a policy environment, the advocates of a certain policy will frame the challenge in a certain way to bring out things they want you to see, while opponents of that, or people who advocate a different policy, will frame it, will frame the debate or frame the facts in another way to draw out different aspects. In policy framing analysis, there are some steps we take, looking at what is the policy problem, and here the policy problem is about legal sale of unpasteurized milk or raw milk. What's the particular solution necessary to address this? So the solution might be for state governments to relax their public safety regulations on sale of milk. How do the problem and the solution relate to core values or ethical principles? So we're often with framing, we often draw upon core values or these core ethics. So when we think back to the previous lecture about ethical principles, this is a way of relating when we wanted people to see certain things of a story, or then we want to see them through the lens of particular values or ethics. Right? Another interesting part of this with framing analysis is how are kind of frames amplified or diminished, and the press plays a key role in that, and we see that within this case, the raw milk case. Another thing that we see with this is how we have an interesting case with federal government systems like we have in Canada, but especially the federal government system of the US, which devolves certain policies to state levels. And because of there being differences in kind of values across states, we end up with, in the United States case, 50 different experiments of how policies may play out. So Rahn say this is a very interesting case for policy advocacy. So they don't have to take on the advocates of sale of raw milk, don't have to take on the whole United States government at once. They can focus in on some particular place where there may be a more likely acceptance of their arguments and their framing. Focus in on that, try to emphasize, try to get a win in some particular place, and then use that, and then if they get a win, use that as leverage in some other place where they focus in on a particular place. While we think of sometimes as food policies trickling down from the national local level, which we could describe as what's happening in Canada now, where we have one policy set about food safety and sale of the prohibition of sale of raw milk. They also can trickle up, as we see in the United States case, where we've got local level decisions trickling up to national level policy. Three other cases that are relevant to this, or sorry, two other cases relevant to this is labeling of genetically modified organisms on food packaging, where state regulations were set in the United States and the national level policy kind of tried to catch up with that. Warning labels on sugar sweetened beverages, that's primarily done at local level, even by cities, and then can trickle up to states and possibly, and then to debates at the national level. In framing, we're thinking about these ethical principles. How do we get people to see different ethical principles in our particular case? In ethical principles, people talk about these universal values, which are trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship. Those are seen as important values really everywhere. If you look at stories about different core values by country, you see some differences. So for example, the US, Paul Kearney talks about these as important values: progress, participation, independence, fairness, economic growth. Where in Canada, we have some of the same values, things like fairness, but also diversity, equity, inclusion, health, safety, democracy, sustainability are values which have shown up in the Canadian Index of Well-being. I wanted to show you an interesting analysis of values across the world. And this Engelhardt Welzel cultural map, which has two dimensions across cultural variation in values, from traditional to rational values. So traditional things are things like religion, parent-child ties, deferential to authority, and traditional value, versus rational values, which are about individual identity and being, or sorry, this is supposed to be relational values, individual identity and being valued by others. And that's on one dimension, so we can go all the way from purely relational to purely traditional on a scale. And then on the other scale is survival versus self-expression. So survival might be just worrying about economic and physical security versus self-expression, where things are important like environmental protection, tolerance of foreigners, tolerance of gays and lesbians, gender equality, and participation in decision-making. And they put different countries and different cultural traditions on this two-dimensional scale. So on the horizontal axis, things range from traditional as -2.5 to relational as 2.5 plus 2.5, and survival to self-expression, survival being -2 to self-expression being 2.5. So you see places like Sweden being high in the relational and self-expressional values. Canada is here. So Canada is where my mouse is. Canada has similar self-expressional values as Sweden, but is about neutral in terms of traditional versus secular. We find, let's look for China. So China is in part of that Confucian box, showing more about survival as a higher value, but also higher on the relational versus traditional. And countries of the Middle East and parts of Africa being more in the lower left-hand box of more traditional and more focused on survival. So those things will come out if you think about trying to appeal to fundamental values. Then appeals to things which are more consistent with fundamental values is going to more likely kind of sway your case. Framing analysis are saying, well, who's involved in framing? Another thing is reframing. So think about that in the picture case. We may take off one frame, put on another frame, people see different things. So even though we actually have the same evidence, we framed it differently, people see different things. Depending on how I framed it, if I'm a proponent of something, you may want to counter-frame it. You might want to address the way I'm framing it and specifically kind of counter that as a right frame. We also look at framing analysis, so we've got who's involved, we've got identification of the frames and links to these core values. So there's some language about framing, reframing, counter-framing, competitive framing. We've got opponents and proponents of a status quo, or frame neutralization is when we've got one way of framing a topic offsets the way that others are framed. And an interesting analysis then is how does this all play out in the public sphere, and how do journalists themselves actually contribute to framing. And what we see is they like to magnify the differences in frames between different groups as a way to sell their stories to their audiences, and especially if they can frame things as wars. An interesting thing is the Ketchup Wars of Southern Ontario that I'll tell you about another time. But you can see these popular books about food wars. Rahn et al. Analyzed this case. One of their background pieces was the Wisconsin legislature and the debates in the Wisconsin legislature about allowing sale of raw milk, where they found that there was a bill brought into the legislature to allow sale of raw milk. There was just a few people who came in to spoke in favor of that, but they used the framing of consumer choice, freedom of choice, and the virtues of small farms. And despite the fact that there were many more people and many more agencies that spoke in favor of maintaining the ban on raw milk sale due to the public health perspective, that frame of freedom of choice, freedom and the power of small farms outweighed the food safety frame. In that case, then the governor vetoed the legislation. Okay, so using that, what Rahn and colleagues did was they did a media analysis. So they went through, because that's where a lot of the framing kind of occurs, is in the public press. They did an analysis of media to say these cases that were brought up, like in Wisconsin and many other states, how were the benefits of raw milk sale framed by the proponents, and how were the benefits of pasteurization framed by the opponents. They found these 6 frames for the proponents of raw milk, so the health benefits of these desirable, keeping in these desirable enzymes that would otherwise be destroyed by pasteurization, the right to choose what to consume, the taste benefits of raw milk, anti-big government, anti-government regulation, anti-big farm, pro-small farm, pro-local foods. These were presented as the benefits of raw milk, and then in opposition to the sale of raw milk were these frames, that this is hazardous to your health, particularly for vulnerable people like children and the elderly, and the fact that if you allowed raw milk sales and people got sick, it would harm the reputation of the whole industry. They then they picked up those different narratives or values that were being appealed to with the pro and anti-raw milk movements. they did an internet survey then of individuals and presented to them one-sided frame, so just the pro or just the anti, or what they call two-sided frames when they said, well, on this hand, there are these benefits possibly of raw milk. On the other hand, there are these concerns about health costs of raw milk. So that's a two-sided frame versus a one-sided frame. They gave them different treatments of that information. Here's some information about possible benefits of raw milk. Here's the information about the problems of raw milk sale. And they tried to figure out how did people respond to that different frame. They found no frame neutralization. Once people had been shown this frame about freedom of choice, pro small farm, pro sort of anti-government, that framing was not neutralized at all by a food safety frame. So you can, once people got onto that, they weren't knocked off their course of believing the benefits of raw milk by information that there were food safety problems. So they concluded overall that the frames being used by the advocates of raw milk, that is this personal choice, liberty, small farm, small government, anti-government, were aligned with these powerful master frames of American culture like individualism, anti-state, and localism. So we're going to be considering in other parts of the course, we're going to consider how debates are framed because we have these challenging problems. As we saw last time, there are many ethical issues, and it's very difficult in food and agriculture problems to find something which doesn't trigger more than one kind of fundamental value or more than one right or more than one kind of ethical principle. So I'm going to stop there. I believe, yes. So I'm going to stop there. So next time we will be coming back and looking at the final thing under this concept part of module 2 is going to be about the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to stop sharing and we'll see.